My father's family home is about a 2-hour drive from where I live. It's a farmhouse, and I've always liked the atmosphere there. Once I got into high school and started riding a motorbike, I often visited during summer and winter breaks. My grandparents were always happy to see me, greeting me warmly with "Thank you for coming." But the last time I went there was just before my senior year of high school, which means it's been over 10 years since I visited. It's not that I didn't go, it's that I couldn't. Here's why. It was early spring break, and the nice weather tempted me to take my bike out to my grandparents' house. Though it was still chilly, the sunny veranda was warm and inviting. I stretched out there for a while, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. Then I heard it.
Po, 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 po.
It was a strange sound. It didn't seem mechanical, but rather like something a person might make. It had an odd, unclear quality, like it was halfway between a voiced and an unvoiced sound. Puzzled, I looked around and noticed a hat floating above the hedge in the yard. It wasn't resting on the hedge, it was moving horizontally, gliding across its top. When it reached a break in the hedge, a woman came into view. As it turned out, the hat was hers. The woman was wearing a pale, whitish dress. But here's the strange part. The hedge was about 2 meters tall. For her head to rise above it, she'd have to be an incredibly tall woman. I was stunned. The woman moved again and disappeared from view, taking the hat with her. At some point, the strange po-po-po sound stopped as well, leaving behind an eerie silence. At first, I dismissed it as either a naturally tall woman wearing absurdly high platform boots or a tall man cross-dressing in high heels. It didn't seem like a big deal. Later, while drinking tea in the living room, I casually recounted the incident to my grandparents. Earlier, I saw a really tall woman. Maybe it was just a man dressed as a woman? They responded with a vague, "Oh, really?" as if they weren't particularly interested. But when I added, she was taller than the hedge, wearing a hat, and making this weird po-po-po sound, their reactions changed drastically. They froze, completely. It was as if someone had pressed pause on them. Then my grandfather broke the silence, his expression turning stern. He bombarded me with questions. When did you see this? Where exactly? How much taller than the hedge was she? His tone was almost angry. Startled by his intensity, I answered each question as best I could. Once I finished, he fell silent, stood up abruptly, and walked out to the hallway. I heard him make a phone call, but I couldn't make out what he was saying because he'd closed the sliding door. Meanwhile, my grandmother looked visibly shaken, trembling slightly as she sat there. After a while, my grandfather returned. He looked at me gravely and said, "You're staying here tonight. No, you're not going home today, no matter what." I panicked internally. Had I done something terribly wrong? I racked my brain, trying to figure it out, but nothing came to mind. It wasn't like I had sought out the woman. She had appeared before me. Then he turned to my grandmother and said, "Take care of the rest. I'm going to pick up K-San." Without another word, he got into the small truck and drove off. Feeling uneasy, I hesitantly asked my grandmother what was going on. She responded in a trembling voice, "It seems you've caught the attention of Hachishaku-sama. Your grandfather will take care of it. Don't worry about a thing." After that, she began telling me bits and pieces about the situation as we waited for my grandfather to return. In this area, there's something troublesome known as Hachishaku-sama. Hachishaku-sama appears as a tall woman, about 8 shaku tall, as her name suggests. She laughs in an eerie, deep male-like voice. Bo-bo-bo-bo. People who see her describe her differently, sometimes as a young woman in morning clothes, an old woman in a formal kimono, or a middle-aged woman in workwear. But her unnaturally tall stature, the hat or something similar she wears on her head, and her unsettling laughter are always the same. There's a rumor that she first arrived here following a traveler, but no one knows for sure. This district, now part of City Nai, but formerly village, corresponding to what is now called Oaza, or a major section of a town, has her sealed away by guardian statues, so she cannot leave the area. If someone catches her attention, they are said to die within a few days. The last recorded incident of her taking a victim was around 15 years ago. Later, I learned that the guardian statues were placed at the borders of the village to block the limited paths she can take to move between areas. There are 4 such statues, one at each cardinal direction of the boundaries. Apparently, these arrangements were the result of some kind of agreement with neighboring villages. For example, they might have exchanged her containment for certain water rights or other concessions. Since the damage she caused was rare, occurring once every several years to a decade or more, it seems the people of the past considered it an acceptable trade-off if they could secure advantageous terms. Hearing all of this, it didn't feel real to me. And of course, why would it? Eventually, my grandfather returned, bringing an elderly woman with him. "This is serious," she muttered as she handed me a talisman. "Hold on to this for now." The elderly woman, whom they referred to as Kei-san, went upstairs with my grandfather. I could hear them doing something, though I wasn't sure what. Meanwhile, my grandmother stayed by my side and refused to leave me alone. Even when I needed to use the bathroom, she insisted on coming along and wouldn't let me close the door all the way. At that moment, it finally started sinking in. This might actually be really bad. After a while, I was taken upstairs and ushered into a room. The windows were completely sealed with layers of newspaper, over which talismans had been carefully affixed. In each of the 4 corners of the room, small piles of salt had been placed. In the center of the room stood a wooden box-like structure, not quite an altar, and on top of it rested a small Buddhist statue. Oddly enough, there were also 2 portable toilets sitting off to the side, seemingly prepared for me to use. "So this is how I'm supposed to manage?" I thought grimly. Grandfather spoke to me sternly, his face grave. "The sun is about to set. Listen carefully. Do not leave this room until morning. Neither your grandmother nor I will call for you or speak to you in any way. You must not leave until 7 a.m. tomorrow. At 7 a.m., you can come out on your own. We've already informed your family." His tone was so serious that all I could do was nod silently. "Follow these instructions carefully. Keep the talisman with you at all times. If something happens, pray before the Buddha," added Kei-san. I was allowed to keep the TV on, so I turned it on for some distraction. But no matter what was playing, I couldn't focus. It felt like white noise to my nerves. My grandmother had given me rice balls and snacks earlier, but I couldn't bring myself to touch them. Instead, I wrapped myself in the futon, trembling, waiting for time to pass. Despite everything, I must have eventually fallen asleep. When I woke up, the TV was still on, broadcasting some late-night show I can't recall. I checked my watch. It was just past 1 a.m. What a horrible time to wake up, I thought. Then I heard it. A light tapping sound on the window. It wasn't the sharp sound of pebbles hitting the glass. It was softer, like someone gently knocking with their fingers. I couldn't tell if it was the wind causing the noise or if someone was truly tapping on the glass. Desperately, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind. I took a sip of tea to calm my nerves, but it didn't help. My fear grew stronger. Turning up the TV's volume, I forced myself to focus on the screen, trying to drown out the unease. That's when I heard my grandfather's voice. "Hey, are you all right? If you're scared, don't push yourself too hard." Relieved for a moment, I almost approached the door, but then I remembered his warning earlier. "We won't call for you or speak to you in any way." The voice came again. "What's wrong? You can come over here if you'd like." It sounded exactly like my grandfather's voice, but something about it felt off. Deep down, I knew it wasn't him. I can't explain why. I just knew. As soon as the thought hit me, goosebumps erupted all over my body. Glancing at the pile of salt in the corner, I saw that the top layer had turned black. I checked my watch to confirm the time. It matched what I had seen earlier. Gathering my courage, I slowly opened the door. Standing outside were my grandmother and Kei-san, their faces full of worry. The moment my grandmother saw me, tears streamed down her face as she exclaimed, "Thank goodness! Thank goodness!" Downstairs, I found my father waiting as well. My grandfather appeared from outside, poking his head through the doorway. "Hurry up and get in the car," he urged. Stepping into the yard, I saw a large van parked there, a 9-seater, and several men standing nearby. I was guided to the middle seat in the second row, surrounded on all sides. Kei-san sat in the front passenger seat, and the men who had been waiting in the yard filled the other seats. Including me, there were 9 people in the van, forming a protective circle around me. "This is a serious situation," said a man seated to my right who looked to be around 50. "You might feel curious, but from now on, keep your eyes closed and your head down. We can't see anything, but you might. Don't open your eyes until we say it's okay." His stern tone left no room for argument. The convoy began to move, led by my grandfather driving his K truck. The van I was in followed, with my father's car bringing up the rear. The pace was slow, barely 20 kilometers per hour, if even that. Not long after we set off, K-san murmured, "This is the critical moment," and began chanting what sounded like a Buddhist prayer. I kept my eyes shut tight, clutching the talisman in my hands, trying to block out everything but the sound of her chanting. Then that voice came again.
"Bo. Bo. Bo. Bo."
I clutched the talisman K-san had given me, kept my eyes shut tight, and bowed my head as instructed. But for some reason I couldn't resist the urge. I cracked my eyes open just a little and peeked outside. What I saw chilled me to the core. A white dress. It was moving in tandem with the car. Was it keeping up with those long strides? The head was above the window and out of sight, but then it began to tilt downward, as if trying to peer into the car. Unconsciously, I let out a small gasp. "Don't look!" The man next to me snapped in a sharp, hushed voice. I quickly shut my eyes again and gripped the talisman even tighter. The tapping on the glass began. Even though no one else could see or hear her voice, everyone in the car reacted to the sound. Some let out stifled gasps, others muttered, or what, under their breath. It seemed the sound was something we couldn't escape, no matter what protections were in place. K-san's chanting grew louder and more fervent. Eventually, the knocking and the voice ceased. Then K-san finally spoke, her tone relieved. We made it through. The tension in the van broke as the men surrounding me murmured in relief. "Thank goodness, it's over," they said. The car stopped in a wider area of the road, and I was transferred to my father's vehicle. As this happened, I saw my grandfather and father bowing deeply to the men who had been in the van with us. K-san approached me and said, "Show me the talisman." I looked down at my hand, realizing I was still clutching it tightly. The talisman had turned almost completely black. K-san handed me a new one, saying, "You should be safe now, but keep this with you just in case." After that, my father and I headed home together. Later, my grandfather and a neighbor delivered my bike back to me. My father, it turned out, knew about Hachishaku-sama as well. He shared a story from his childhood about a friend who had caught her attention and lost his life. He also mentioned that some people had moved away to escape her, only to fall victim later. The men in the van, I learned, were all distant relatives, part of my grandfather's extended family. That's why they had been willing to help. My grandfather driving ahead and my father driving behind were both blood relatives, which was part of an effort to confuse Hachishaku-sama. The plan was hastily assembled, and since my father's brothers couldn't make it overnight, they had to rely on other relatives who could gather quickly. The night in the sealed room was to ensure my safety, as traveling at night was deemed more dangerous. My grandfather and father were even prepared to sacrifice themselves if it came to that. When we arrived home, my grandfather called to check in on me. I asked him if he had called out to me that night. He firmly denied it, saying he hadn't spoken to me at all. So that really wasn't him. The thought sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. Hachishaku-sama's victims are often young people, particularly those who haven't yet reached adulthood. It's said that when children or teenagers are in a state of extreme anxiety and hear a familiar voice calling out to them, they are more likely to let their guard down and fall prey to her. 10 years passed, and the incident had faded from my memory. But then, something happened that brought it all rushing back. Something I couldn't laugh off. I received a phone call from my grandmother. The Jizo statue sealing Hachishaku-sama has been destroyed, and it's the one on the road leading to your house. I froze. My grandfather had passed away 2 years earlier. I wasn't allowed to attend his funeral. Before he became bedridden, he had explicitly told my family not to let me come under any circumstances. Even now, I try to convince myself that it's all just superstition. But deep down, I can't shake the unease. What if I hear it again?
Po. 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 Po.
If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to our channel. We share real horror stories that happened in Japan. Don't miss out.